Last year, over 1 trillion photographs were taken. 1 trillion. That's a pretty amazing number if you think about it. And many of you contributed to that number with photographs of your family, of your friends, of your experiences. They all fill the digital world of content. Photographs of your favorite pets, perhaps your favorite lunch. All of those photographs represent something to you. Take a moment and think about an image that means something to you. Over the last 30 years, during my career, I have focused on raising awareness about human rights. I have photographed in over 100 countries. I have documented over 25 conflicts. When I'm asked, why do you do that? Why do you think there's value in photographs? Why do you think there's value in risking your life to take photographs? The questions are quite good. The answers are those that form the foundation of why I do what I do. And they're also the reason why I'm directing a film called Biography of a Photo, which examines the lives of 2 of my photographs. So, to kind of step back a little bit and help answer the questions, I bring you back to the year 1989, another period, another world. I'm a young photographer working in New York. I want to be an international photographer. I was photographing an event, and I see this photographer on the street, and he looks like the quintessential international photojournalist. Press credentials, the right cameras, the very important photojournalism scarf. So I said, okay, this is a guy I should talk to. I introduced myself. His name was Chris Morris. And I said, Chris, where are you going next? And Chris said, I'm going to Panama. I said, Chris, that's amazing. I'm also going to Panama. I didn't know where Panama was. I didn't know what was happening in Panama. But if this guy was going to Panama, that was the place to go if you wanted to be an international photographer. The story in Panama was that it was being run by a dictator named General Manuel Noriega. His relationship with the United States had faltered, and he had decided to hold elections to prove to the world that he was loved by his people. I got an assignment to go and cover the story. I was very excited. I was on my way to becoming an international photographer. Just before I was about to buy my plane ticket, my assignment was canceled, and I was crushed. I had been working as a bike messenger, driving an ice cream truck. I wasn't really surviving as a photographer, so I couldn't afford to buy a plane ticket. I ran into Chris, and amazingly, he had just bought his ticket, and the airline had a buy one, get one free special, like a revolution special. And Chris said, you can have my extra ticket. I said, thank you. And off we went to Panama to document the election. I started by selling photographs $50 at a time to Agence France-Presse, a French wire service. I encountered my first situations of violence, tear gas, rubber bullets, clashes between the opposition and government supporters. It was an eye-opening experience. The dictator Noriega held the election. He lost the election. He then nullified the results of the election. And the would-be victors came out onto the street to start an uprising. They were met with serious violence. I was following the vice president-elect and his entourage as they drove through the streets. At one point, they got stopped by police and soldiers, and there was a standoff. All of a sudden, a group of men known as the Dignity Battalion, a paramilitary unit supporting the dictator, came running towards them. It was complete chaos. They had bats, they had pistols, and I was trying to photograph and look around and do whatever I could do. Then, at one point, a man walked over to a vehicle, took out a pistol, and fired a gun into the car. A few moments went by, the door eventually opened. A man staggered out of the car, covered in blood. It took me a moment to realize who he was. It was the vice president-elect, Guillermo Billy Ford. As I moved toward him to photograph, I heard somebody say, "Con permiso," in Spanish, excuse me. And the man stepped around me and began to attack the vice president. The vice president defended himself, and within moments, the whole thing was over. I brought my film back to the AFP office. The film was processed and transmitted around the world. And here, look at this photograph carefully. You see the vice president on the left, covered in blood, being beaten, as a soldier stands behind and watches and does nothing. By the next day, the photograph was on the front page of newspapers around the world. And by the end of the week, was on the covers of Newsweek, US News, and Time magazine, all in the same week. A unique moment for a photographer. I thought, this photojournalism thing is pretty easy. You go places, you take pictures, you get covers. I'm going to become famous, I'm going to make lots and lots of money. Not true at all. And I was pretty excited. For the next 7 months, the United States tried to oust, through diplomacy, the Noriega government. They started to use the Time magazine cover as one of the reasons why Noriega should be thrown out of power. The diplomacy failed, and by December of that year, the United States invaded Panama. The President of the United States gave a speech to the world on a number of the justifications for the invasion.
You remember those horrible pictures of newly elected Vice President Ford, covered head to toe with blood, beaten mercilessly by so-called dignity battalions.
When I heard that speech and saw the action, I realized this wasn't about covers, it wasn't about fame, it wasn't about me. It was about what I was doing in terms of providing work, providing imagery to be part of a chain, part of a conversation, for information to be put out there for people to make decisions. I was there as your eyes. And it wasn't whether or not I agreed with the invasion, which was said to have killed thousands of Panamanians. It was just the understanding that the work that I was choosing to do could have impact on the world. That's what I found incredibly interesting. Now let's jump ahead 2 years. It's 1991. I read a story about this place called Yugoslavia, a country in Eastern Europe, that everybody thought was going to make this amazing transition in the post-Soviet world. But there were these rumblings of nationalism, violent nationalism, and nobody was exactly sure what was going to happen. In fact, over the next 10 years, I spent more than 5 years on the ground documenting the very brutal breakup of that country. By 1992, I found myself in a small city in Bosnia on the border with Serbia. It was a town called Bijeljina, and when I had arrived, the town was already split, with Muslim civilians on one side and Serbian civilians on the other, and they were fighting. The butcher was fighting against the banker, the bookkeeper was fighting against the policeman. It was complete chaos, and civil society had broken down. Violence escalated to a new level with the arrival of Arkan, a Serbian warlord, and his unit known as the Tigers. I had worked with Arkan before, and he gave me permission to work with his troops. He said he was there to, quote-unquote, cleanse the town of Muslim fundamentalists. We moved into the center of town, eventually arriving at a mosque. The soldiers went up to the mosque, they took down the Islamic flag, they posed for a victory photo. Right after this, I started to hear some shouting from across the street, and I walked outside. There was a house with a red brick wall, and a couple had been brought out in front of the wall. The woman, Hamieta Pajeti, and her husband Abdurraham were shouting at the soldiers. The soldiers were shouting at them. They were simultaneously shouting at me, "Don't take any photographs." Shots rang out, and Abdurraham fell to the ground. Immediately, this was obvious this was a war crime. What was striking to me was that nobody cared that I was there with the camera, and it seemed to me at that moment there was very little I could do to stop anything that was happening. Several months earlier, I had been in a very similar situation where somebody was executed in front of me, which I couldn't stop, nor could I even document for the evidence of the crime. I had vowed never to let that happen again. So I tried to figure out how to be able to take a photograph of what was happening, and eventually I was able to photograph Hamieta as she tried to save Abdurraham as he lay there bleeding. Moments later, Hamieta was shot. A few moments later, another woman, Aisha Shabanovic, was brought out, and she too was shot. Then a prisoner was brought out. Turned out to be Aisha's son. He tried to escape. They shot him. Again, nothing I could do to stop it, and nothing I could do to document it. Then Harush Zabiri was brought out as a prisoner. For some reason, they let me photograph him. But I realized that I needed an image of the soldiers and the victims in the same frame, so that nobody could dispute what was happening, that the evidence was there to prove everybody that this was a war crime. And here you see in this photograph the Serbian paramilitaries, the Tigers, with their victims. Now look closely at this photograph of the soldier on the right, a cigarette in one hand, sunglasses on his head, as he casually brings his boot back as the victims, the Pajatis and Aisha Shabanovic, lay dying on the street. This is a photograph that was called an excess of violence. This is the documentation of ethnic cleansing. The conversation in the world at the time was that the Bosnian War was about to erupt unless there was intervention from the West. I thought that these photographs, which were published around the world, would be the evidence to push the West into intervening. President Bush, who reacted to my Panama photographs earlier, was still president of the United States, so for sure there would be something. There was no reaction from anybody. The war started. It lasted for almost 4 years. Thousands were killed. Millions more became refugees, led to several more wars, and today Bosnia is a dysfunctional country. It became apparent to me that the work had failed, and I had to ask myself, what was I doing as a journalist? Arkan, so angry that these photographs were seen, had vowed, quote unquote, to look forward to the day he would drink my blood, and he put me on a death list. So I had to decide, should I keep working? What was the purpose? And I realized, after some time, that when the photographs failed in their attempt to try to garner any kind of change immediately, they took on another life. They took on a life of evidence to hold people responsible for their actions. So obviously the soldiers in the photographs, those that gave them the orders, and so on, to be held responsible. But more importantly, I thought, to hold people responsible for their inaction, for the leaders that saw these photographs and did nothing. They witnessed a war crime and said nothing. They are also responsible. And by extension, what does that mean for all of us, the ones that put these people in power, the ones that did not take to the streets to protest? What happens today when we look at photographs from various places and we don't react? So with those sort of twin foundations of photojournalism, I move forward continuing to do this work. As I started working with my co-director, Dr. Lauren Walsh, on Biography of a Photo, we started to discover that the photograph from Panama and the photograph from Bosnia lived on and on. Most news photographs last a day or two and disappear. Most of you look at an Instagram photo, you swipe it, you like it, you forget about it 15 minutes later. These photographs continue to have impact months, years later. It's very unusual for work. And the photographs, as we looked at their biographies, they weave this narrative that show how the history, the memory, and cultural fabric of each area is formed. So let's look at the photograph from Panama. Shortly after it was taken, the dictatorship declared it illegal, but it gave hope to the opposition that people were actually paying attention to what was going on. The vice president-elect, Guillermo Billy Ford, said, quote, "The photograph saved his life. It made him into an international figure that couldn't be touched." An opposition leader said, "My friends died for democracy. The photo changed everything. It renewed our courage to stand up and fight." With the photograph from Bosnia, even though it failed on an international level, was quickly made into a recruiting poster for people to come over and volunteer to fight to protect their Muslim brethren. It was seen around the Islamic world. The photograph was continuously published in newspapers both inside and outside Bosnia. Artists did their own versions of the photograph as a protest to the war. The French filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard did a short film on the photograph as a voiceover meditates on man's inhumanity to man and the lack of intervention in the Bosnian War. With the formation of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, during the opening day speech, the photograph was said to be one of the inspirations for the creation of the court. The image was used to indict and convict war criminals as recently as just a few months ago.
These are civilians, I always assume, and they are being killed, executed in the most brutal manner by a beast, not by a human being. by a beast. So you can imagine what that means and why the tribunal has used it.
You're aware that these photos were published and distributed essentially worldwide and roughly at the time and since. Well, you know, it doesn't take much to go to a website called Iconic Photographs, which means photographs that are particularly famous.
In the world of education, where neither conflict is taught in each country, multiple generations know the work and understand the history through the photographs. In Panama, each year they mark the anniversary of the US invasion. Many Panamanians consider that invasion a war crime, and they connect it directly to the photo. Recently, when filming one of the demonstrations, a man recognized me and became so incensed that I was the photographer that he tried to get a mob to attack me.
Tu foto hizo que mataran gente en mi país. Tu foto. Tú dijiste, igual lo hiciste en Sarajevo, igual lo hiciste en Somalia. Tú dijiste que esta foto que salió en Times fue la que...
But not all Panamanians feel the same way. Former Panamanian President Varela said, quote, "The photograph gave Panama back its democracy," which is a pretty amazing thing to say about a photograph. This is just a few of the ways that the photos have played a role in shaping the histories of the places where they were taken. And then as we kept working on the film at Biography of a Photo, we found that for each photograph, there was somebody who was personally connected to each image and the events of the day. In Panama, we have Manuel Guerra, whose brother Alexis Guerra was the bodyguard who was assigned to protect Vice President Ford. The blood that you see on Ford's shirt is of the bodyguards. And then we have Alma Pekovic, whose mother Aisha Shabanovich lays dying in the photograph. They're both on a personal quest for justice. The images are famous, but their family members, the little people, the working class bodyguard, and the civilian bystander are in danger of being forgotten by history. They want justice for their relatives. Manuel is fighting for his brother's remembrance. He wants us connected to the photograph that represents the democracy of Panama.
Todos los días paso por donde lo que ocurrió ese día y usted sabe, es un sentimiento que no se puede explicar, que lo llevo dentro de mí, que no se ha podido concretar todas las cosas que se han dicho, que hicieron, y hasta la fecha estoy esperando esa justicia que no se ha dado todavía. Yo quiero que esas fotos que se vivió ese día queden en la historia. Y en el monumento, en vez de poner una placa, el último que murió fue Manuel Alexis Guerra Morales, que pasó ese 10 de mayo.
And Alma wants something simpler, a form of justice. She wants the soldiers in the photograph to be indicted and convicted of war crimes, a charge that nobody has been given up until this point.
Ko želju da završim sve ovo, da pravdu istjera na vidjelo, da ljudi koji su odgovorni za ovo odgovaraju. Ništa se ne dešava, ništa se nije pomaklo s mjesta. Oni šetaju slobodno, žive, rade, uživaju. Mojih roditelja, mog brata, mojih komšija, prijatelja nema više.
So photographs have the opportunity to inform and influence, sometimes under the guidance of the media, and sometimes they travel the world on their own, hopefully having some impact wherever they are seen. I hope this gives you all a new way of thinking about photos, those that you see and those that you take. Thank you very much.